All right. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I am Matthew Browngan, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for coming, folks. So today, going to be talking a bit about the Rittenhouse trial, Ahmaud Arbery, CRT, and the legacy of Jim Crow within all of this. It's a mess. And of course, battle lines are being drawn, and it's, he's either a, hero, whatever. Things are a mess. So let's put one thing into context. Globally, there is really no other country in this world that would look at the situation where it is normalized for multiple people in this situation to be holding a weapon, a gun, and somebody be killed and somehow have it seen as anything but chaotic and violent. And somehow we're normalizing this, the press is normalizing this two sides, so on and so forth. It's a mess. But let's really kind of break through this. One, with Rittenhouse, he killed somebody by the time they were chasing him. He already killed one person. A person that was of no threat to him, and then decided to run away carrying this weapon, and somebody chased him and he shot him. The details in a way don't really matter as much as what the judge was doing. Maybe he acted in self-defense, maybe he didn't. He pretty much didn't to me, again, based on the fact that the first person he killed was not a proportional response as far as the use of force. He threw a bag at him, like a plastic bag with soft whatever. His life wasn't in danger. He was scared. He was a scared kid, 17-year-old kid carrying a gun across state lines. It wasn't his community, unless you are thinking about the white community. And the justification is he was protecting property. So property is worth more than somebody's life, apparently, or multiple people's lives. On top of the fact that these people, they were white folks that were protesting state violence targeting Black Americans. This country has a long history of, at times, holding people more accountable than not more accountable, but holding white people that stand up for Black liberation. They love to inflict violence and horror upon those folks. To make an example of them. It happened during Reconstruction. People's lives were threatened and people were dragged out of their homes, killed, beat, and down the line of white elected representatives that were Republicans and attempting to uphold Reconstruction. It's a long history of this. But there's the judge, there's so many other things wrong with what happened. The police response, to begin with, and seeing him as a friendly, him identifying himself as a friendly. And the judge, who said that they can't, the prosecutors couldn't call the victims, but they could call them looters or rioters. The justification for not calling them victims was because there's a loaded term, but somehow looters and rioters aren't loaded. The judge was giving signals to the jury to basically just let him off the hook. From being buddies with him, sitting behind him, or letting Rittenhouse sit behind him, picking the jury pool, and the judge was giving signals to the jury to let him off. It was clear that this judge was attempting to funnel this trial down towards a verdict. Regardless of any of the debates or the details of the case, that's what was going on, and that is really out of Jim Crow. But the thing is that this person, I mean, it's out of Jim Crow, but this practice didn't end, and it goes beyond Rittenhouse. It's how we see there's criminal judges all across the country that funnel cases down a route towards how they behave towards black defendants versus white defendants, and all these different ways they twist and turn to uphold certain laws or not uphold certain laws, to uphold certain practices or not. And this is really what CRT, critical race theory, is really getting at. How systemic and institutional racism, particularly in the application of law or the misapplication of law, permeates throughout. It's about systems, not, and how individuals might be part of it, but it really looks at it at the macro level and how these things replicate itself. And these things are real problems. And then you have Ahmaud Arbery, where you had the DA and this former cop that there's a relationship with, that these three white men killed Ahmaud, who was running. He was just running. And, off really no evidence, and somehow they claimed self-defense. This DA didn't pursue charges because of their relationship, that she buried it. She buried this. Her defense was, well, because my relationship with them, I didn't pursue charges, and so on and so forth. But she never really passed it along. And the officers or the current police department or the police department didn't really take any action either. Again, this is a Jim Crow practice, or something rooted within Jim Crow and Reconstruction, that is still a practice that permeates across the country, of relationship-based application of law. DAs, cops, former cops, their family members down the line protect each other. And particularly when this comes to crimes against black folks. And we see even then the mentality of slave catchers that was within this, and really within both cases in a sense, of the needing to patrol the out-of-control black folks. And we are taking the law into our own hands to make sure black folks are being kept in line. This is a very regular practice. But then we think about these are self-defense laws, such as Castle Doctrine or Stand Your Ground laws. These things, and we see this across the nation, don't seem to apply to black defendants, and really only apply to white defendants, particularly white men, or at least white presenting men, such as Zimmerman. And a lot of folks confused. Well, here's Latino. Well, forgetting Latino's a broad encompassing an ethnicity, not a race. There are white Latinos and black Latinos and indigenous Latino. It's about really the basis of, it's rooted in the origins of language. The Latin roots of Spanish. That's it. That's it. That's really what it is, as well as Portuguese. Sort of, depending on who you talk. That's why there's such a thing as Afro-Latinos and white Latinos. Go to Puerto Rico. It'll you go to the Caribbean. There's so many. It's a whole thing. So these laws don't apply to black Americans, particularly, or really anybody outside of white men for the most part. A good example of this is also in Kenosha with Crystal Kaiser, 17-year-old, who was charged and prosecuted and convicted of first-degree murder when she killed the man that held her captive, sexually abused her, raped her for over a year. She was not awarded self-defense. And we see this throughout the justice system, particularly for women. About 30-40% of women in our prison system are charged with violent offenses for defending themselves against their abusers. The vast majority, like 80-90% of women in our correctional facilities, have been sexually and physically abused. And/or physically abused. These types of things aren't taken into account. So again, this is something critical race theory can help explain, particularly when it comes to black women and how and who the law applies to. This idea of that it protects the in-group who the law doesn't have to apply to. And it, well, targets the out-group who the law must apply to. And the out-group here are Black Americans. Now, there are definitely subtleties and a whole scope of things around this. And I suggest you jump back, blanking out on the exact one, but really talk a bit about the justice system and how there's multiple justice systems. Because if you're poor and white, the application of law is going to be different to you than if you're wealthy and white. But that is not to say that poor white people still don't benefit from a misapplication of law, particularly through the lens of CRT. In various different ways. Rittenhouse is one of these. He wasn't that wealthy. But yet, again, we see how it was applied. But this isn't isolated. This isn't anything new. Scores of militia violence were seen during Reconstruction and during Jim Crow. I mean, the KKK is perhaps the most well-known portion of this, but there's others like the White League and others that were just kind of smaller local types of things, as well as the intersections between law enforcement, these militias, judges and prosecutors and district attorneys all across the country. This stuff wasn't just in the South. White men causing riots or lynchings, claiming self-defense in the process, instigating and then claiming self-defense and getting off scot-free. Very few white folks were ever prosecuted for thousands upon thousands of murders, killings, lynchings, hundreds of race riots instigated by white folks across the country. Very few faced any accountability for this. And this continues to this day. Now, the only reason why Ahmaud Arbery's killers were convicted was because of a dedicated local investigative journalist, as well as the killers arrogantly posting video of this. And then something happened. A couple of years later. This happened, 2019, I want to believe. This is where we are. This is nothing new. And to really highlight some of this, some of this stuff is taken from Michael Fitzgerald, A Splendid Failure, in really looking at Reconstruction. So he's talking in Sumter County. This guy Smith gave a speech at the courthouse. Well, one listener, very much in liquor, stood close to the governor. So this guy was governor of Alabama, Smith, in 1968. And this guy in liquor that stood close with a large knife in his hand, drawn, while several others came in with revolvers on their persons. Feels familiar, doesn't it? Smith was finally drowned out by insulting remarks from the audience, but he was allowed to depart alive. Northern men were often less lucky. Charles Stearns, an abolitionist who settled in Georgia, ran for a judge in Columbia County and won by 1,200 votes. As he traveled his circuit, however, mobs attended his court, shouting that Stearns had been elected by N-word votes and that N-words had no right to vote. Having fought beside free soilers and Bleeding Kansas, Stearns was no coward, but after Democrats dragged him from his home and savagely beat a black employee, the judge resigned his position and returned to Massachusetts. It seems that no Yankee who does his duty can live down south. Yeah, and then there was this other person, an Ames correspondent, said this after witnessing the murder of Republican chief of police. The assassin can do his bloody work without fear of punishment, so long as he confines himself to the butchery of northern men. Again, this feels familiar, doesn't it? And really, let's think about this. The long march towards Plessy versus Ferguson, which instituted the idea of separate but equal, was underway. Administration leaders should have seen it coming. The 1875 Reese decision sapped the enforcement of the 15th Amendment in the state election. And this was really in response to the prosecution of the Colfax Massacre. The Supreme Court concluded that the 14th Amendment banned racial discrimination only by government. This undermined the Ku Klux Klan laws, which helped them prosecute militias after the rise of Klan violence for the first time. For if the states failed to act against individual violators, no earthly redress existed. The decision demonstrated that obviously guilty murderers could not be punished in federal courts. It was a green light for racial extremism while providing a constitutional rationale for the retreat of Northern opinion. None of this had happened. With lifetime tenure, the federal courts could have been a bastion of civil rights enforcement, but instead, they orchestrated surrender. Given the fatal implications for his enforcement policies, Grant's inattention seems unaccountable. And again, this is going on about the failure of the stuff. And one last one to really wrap this up, to hammer home the point. The White Leagues became the Deep South model for regaining power. By abandoning the Klan's sheets, paramilitaries looked more like a legitimate political movement with intimidation excused more readily as self-defense. The showdown came in September 1874 when Democratic leaders attempted yet another coup. There were multiple coups in state legislatures and local elections, or at least coup attempts. The only known one is in North Carolina when the entire government was overthrown. Maybe that's another thing we can dig into. But this showdown came in 1874 when Democrats attempted another coup. White Leagues descended on New Orleans by the thousands, this time routing the Metropolitan Police under General Longstreet at the foot of Canal Street. Grant sent troops, and the White League immediately withdrew in an agile show of discretion. Grant thought this a winning issue, but the fall's elections became a snap referendum on Reconstruction in an unattractive venue. In the Nation's view, the what we know is the magazine right now, The Nation, the president enforced the illegal orders of an incompetent court in behalf of a local faction of which his brother-in-law was a leading member. And he recognized a governor whom a congressional committee had pronounced an usurper. An accumulation of half troops, perhaps, but the Republicans had accumulated years of liabilities in Louisiana. I think that the thing to really zero in here was paramilitaries ended up looking more like legitimate political movements, with intimidation excused more readily as self-defense. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing these militias, these paramilitaries, these armed folks become a normal wing and part of the Republican Party. They're institutionalized now within the party itself. They're becoming a so-called legitimate political movement, and a lot of our moderates and our press are covering it as such, that these folks are legitimate and aren't a full threat to democracy. It's absolutely a madness that's going on here. And again, it's nothing new. So it's hard to know exactly where to go, but one of the biggest things is to not disengage from democracy. And that seemed really hard at this point. I mean, so hard at this point. But the only way for us, well, one of the only ways, and one of the strategies, it's not the only thing, but we have to fully embrace democracy, as well as, I mean, so many other things. This is where the idea of the whole justice system is guilty as hell and needs to be torn down and built from the ground up again. Because we're going to keep getting these same type of general results. And again, Ahmaud Arbery's killers, it's a miracle they were even charged. It wasn't going to go to trial. And the thing is, a lot of us were surprised that these folks were even found guilty. But it's more of an exception than the rule that they were even found guilty. The rule is they weren't even charged at first. So that's where we are. But we have to option into democracy. We have to option in towards mass mobilization and disruption. We have to hold those that are supposed to be upholding democracy. I'm not talking about those that are selling it out wholesale and that are fighting against it, but against folks that are Democrats that are tepid to pass voting rights legislation and to act in aggression against anti-democratic forces. If you don't act in aggression, then anti-democratic forces are going to win out. And that is exactly what happened with the failure of Reconstruction. With that said, thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Browning, your host. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Please hit subscribe, share, 5-star review, all that fun stuff. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving break, and looks like this week's going to be a little warm and enjoying the weather a little bit, I guess, this early winter-ish, late fall. Anyways, thanks for coming, and have yourselves a good one.
This is 365 Media.